Every year, millions battle addiction rehab after rehab, relapse after relapse. Why do so many treatments fail? Because most solutions only touch the surface. Jung believed that addiction is not just a disease, it is a spiritual hunger. In this video, we dive into how to overcome addiction not by resisting it, but by understanding what it truly represents. We often think of addiction in terms of substances, alcohol, opioids, nicotine, or perhaps behaviors, gambling, sex, even social media. And we think of them as problems to be treated, managed, restrained, or eliminated. But Carl Jung saw something deeper, something unsettling, something profoundly human. To Jung, addiction was not merely a pathological condition or a chemical dependency. It was not just a malfunction of brain chemistry or a flaw in willpower. It was, at its core, a spiritual issue, a psychic cry, an existential hunger. Jung once remarked in a now famous letter to a colleague that the alcoholic's craving is a low-level thirst for wholeness. He used the Latin spiritus contra spiritum, the same word. Spiritus means both alcohol and spirit. He meant that what drives a person to drink is not just the taste or the escape, but the longing for transcendence. That craving for the bottle, he believed, is a misguided search for God. Not the God of religion, necessarily, but the God image within the psyche. The self, the archetypal source of meaning, unity, and inner completion. The divine spark that each individual unconsciously longs to reunite with. Modern life, as Jung saw it, had become sterile, mechanized, disenchanted. The gods had retreated from our temples, and we filled the void with distraction. Consumption, noise. The addict in this view is not morally weak or fundamentally broken. He is spiritually starved. Ask yourself this. When someone drinks compulsively, when they shoot heroin or scroll endlessly through digital feeds, what are they running from? Jung would suggest they are not running from pain, but from emptiness, from a life void of meaning, from the unbearable silence left by the loss of inner connection. In ancient times, people lived among myths. They dreamed with gods. They saw themselves as part of a sacred cosmos. But the modern ego, Jung believed, became inflated and isolated. It stopped listening to the soul. The ego wanted to control, rationalize, dominate. But the unconscious refused to be ignored. It rebelled. It sent symptoms. And addiction is one of those symptoms. In this way, addiction becomes a false ritual, a counterfeit initiation. The substance takes the place of sacred experience. The bottle becomes a chalice, the needle becomes a staff, the high becomes a fleeting glimpse of transcendence. But unlike true spiritual experience, addiction never integrates. It only isolates, because the person is not being initiated into wholeness. They are being swallowed by shadow. What's most tragic, Jung would say, is that the addict is often closer to the truth than we realize, closer to the archetypal realm, closer to the raw, unmediated forces of the psyche. But without guidance, without ritual, myth, or meaning, they are overwhelmed. It is not that they seek too little. It is that they seek too much, and in the wrong place. The addict is often a mystic in exile, a visionary without a vision, a soul that has felt the pull of the numinous, but has fallen into its counterfeit. Jung's patients were often men and women of success, outwardly accomplished, yet inwardly hollow. They had followed society's path. Career, wealth, social norms, but inside, they felt the gnawing of something unfulfilled. Jung called this the loss of the soul. And many turned to substances to fill that hollow place. He would not simply take the bottle away. He would ask instead what the bottle was giving them, what need it was fulfilling, what inner God it was trying to awaken. Because until you understand what your addiction is serving, you cannot hope to transcend it. Addiction to Jung was never random. It was symbolic. It pointed to a psychic imbalance, a misalignment of the ego and the self, a failure of inner dialogue. To treat the addiction, then, you must restore that inner relationship. Jung believed that this restoration did not come through punishment or repression, but through meaning. Through the recovery of soul language, through dreams, myth, art, ritual vehicles of the unconscious that reconnect the ego with the greater whole. In his correspondence with Bill Wilson, Jung emphasized that only a deep, transformative experience, something numinous and spiritual, could truly release a person from the grip of addiction, not because it scared them straight, but because it gave them what the addiction was only pretending to provide. Addiction is not a moral failure. It is a misdirected longing for the divine. It is the soul crying out for reunion, the body absorbing the consequences of an inner void. And if we fail to see this, if we only treat the symptoms and not the symbol, we risk silencing the messenger while ignoring the message. There is a part of you that you have never truly met, a voice beneath your thoughts, a face behind your persona. It lives in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in fantasies you dare not name. Carl Jung called this hidden realm the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is not wrong. It is simply the part of you that your conscious mind refuses to accept. Whenever we deny an emotion, whenever we say this is not me, we cast it into the unconscious. We repress it, not to destroy it, but to bury it. And buried things do not die. They grow roots. They take on form. They wait. To understand addiction, Jung urges us to look here not only to the substance or the behavior, but to what has been cast into the dark. Because often the thing we are addicted to is not the problem. It is the solution to a deeper, hidden conflict. Ask yourself, what have you disowned? What part of your nature has been labeled shameful, weak, unacceptable? The shadow is not just the place where trauma hides. It is where power hides, rage, desire, creativity. The truth about your needs and wounds. These are things the ego, the image you show the world, cannot always tolerate. So they are exiled. They become ghosts in your own psyche. And it is often these ghosts that reach for the bottle, for the pill, for the escape. Jung understood that repression creates imbalance. The more we push something down, the more it fights to return. And when it does, it often comes back in distorted form, through dreams, nightmares, anxiety, or addiction. He once wrote that everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. In other words, the more you deny it, the more it controls you. Addiction can be a sign that the shadow is screaming to be acknowledged, that the mask you wear no longer fits, that your inner life, the neglected, hidden part of you, is demanding to be seen. And this is not just personal. From a Jungian perspective, the shadow also includes everything the culture rejects. We grow up in systems that label vulnerability as weakness, anger as dangerous, sensuality as sinful. And so we hide these parts of ourselves not just from others, but from our own awareness. This is where repression begins. And repression becomes a kind of soul amnesia. We forget who we are beneath our conditioning, but the body remembers. The unconscious remembers, and eventually something breaks through. The addict, in this view, is not just chasing pleasure. They are unconsciously trying to reconnect with the parts of themselves they've lost. The drink, the high, the escape. It becomes a portal to the forbidden self. Even if only for a moment, the addict feels free from the prison of persona, free to feel, to rage, to rest, to disappear, not because they want to die, but because the false self they've been forced to uphold no longer feels livable. And so they reach, not out of weakness, but out of a desperate attempt to restore balance. Jung taught that the only way to truly heal is to make the unconscious conscious, to confront the shadow, not to destroy it, but to integrate it, because the shadow, once faced, becomes a source of power. But this confrontation requires courage, not the kind of courage that fights a battle, but the kind that sits in silence and listens. To the dream, to the memory, to the wound that still lives beneath the surface. Jung believed that the addict's transformation begins here, not in resisting temptation, but in understanding what the temptation represents, not in suppressing desire, but in tracing it to its roots. For many, the shadow contains pain. For others, it contains potential. But for all, it contains truth. And the truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. The truth reshapes everything. The repression of the shadow is what causes the psyche to fracture, and addiction, in many cases, is that fracture made visible. But if we learn to look inward, if we dare to face what we've hidden, we may begin to understand what the addiction was trying to tell us all along. What if addiction is not something to fight, but a signal that something deeper must awaken? Carl Jung didn't believe in merely eliminating symptoms. He believed in transformation. He saw addiction not as an enemy to destroy, but as a message from the unconscious, an invitation to begin a journey inward. That journey he called individuation. To the ordinary ear, the word sounds clinical, perhaps even cold. But for Jung, individuation was sacred. It was the soul's unfolding, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are beneath all masks, beyond all roles, outside all inherited beliefs. Addiction often begins where the process of individuation has been interrupted. Instead of becoming whole, a person becomes divided, split between who they are and who they pretend to be. The addict is often someone who has lost contact with their inner world, or worse, never had the tools to enter it. And so the psyche seeks wholeness elsewhere, in dopamine, in intoxication, in the temporary sense of aliveness that a substance provides. But the feeling never lasts because it is not rooted in the self. Jung taught that the human being contains far more than the conscious ego admits. Within us lives a vast landscape, dreams, archetypes, instincts, memories long forgotten yet still alive. The unconscious is not just a storehouse of repressed content. It is the soil of meaning. It is the place where the soul begins to bloom. The path of individuation is the slow integration of this unconscious material into conscious awareness. It is not self-improvement, it is self-discovery, not becoming better but becoming whole. And that is what the addict truly craves, not the next high, but the feeling of being real, of being integrated, of living from a center that cannot be broken. To begin individuation is to ask questions that frighten the ego. Who am I, really? What am I avoiding? What does this addiction represent in symbolic terms? Jung might ask, what archetype are you failing to live out? Is the addict suppressing the artist, the rebel, the mystic? Are they numbing themselves because the life they live does not reflect the soul they carry? In the analytic process, Jung often worked with dreams not as random nonsense, but as messages from the unconscious. Symbols, myths, invitations. A dream of drowning might symbolize emotional overwhelm. A dream of flying, repressed potential. These dreams can't be medicated. They can only be heard, and when they are heard, the psyche responds. It begins to balance itself. For the addict, individuation is not a straight line. It is a spiral, a descent before a rise. There will be confrontation with the shadow, the complexes, the inner child. But this confrontation is the cure, because what we face with honesty we no longer need to escape from. Jung believed that each of us carries within the image of the self, the totality of who we are meant to become. The addiction, he would say, is often a misalignment between the ego and that inner self. The ego chases security, image, control. But the self seeks authenticity, integration, truth. And when the two are in conflict, the person suffers. To heal, the addict must begin to reconcile these two forces, not by obedience to external rules, but by turning inward, by facing the chaos inside with the guidance of symbols, inner work, and often deep psychological support. Jung did not promise an easy path. He did not offer quick fixes. What he offered was the map of the soul, a guide through darkness. He believed that if a person could begin to explore their inner life, through journaling, therapy, dream work, reflection, they could begin to recover not just from addiction, but from disconnection that fuels it. Individuation, then, is not just a psychological process, it is a sacred calling. It is the remembering of the soul, the rebalancing of energies, the reclaiming of the parts once cast out. And in this way, addiction becomes not the end, but the beginning of something deeper. There is a hunger in the human soul that cannot be silenced by logic or restrained by discipline. It is not physical, it is not intellectual. It is the hunger for the numinous, for the sacred, for the real. Carl Jung believed that addiction was, at its root, the symptom of a spiritual starvation. Not merely an escape from suffering, but a substitution for transcendence. He wrote to Bill Wilson, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, that the craving for alcohol was, in truth, the equivalent, on a low level, of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness, and that no true healing could occur unless that thirst was quenched by a genuine inner experience. What did he mean by this? He meant that the psyche, in its essence, longs to touch something greater than the ego, greater than routine, greater than the masks and defenses we build. It longs for what Jung called the numinous, a word he used to describe an encounter with the vast, the mysterious, the awe-inspiring force that lies at the heart of life itself. This experience is not reserved for saints or mystics. It appears in dreams, in moments of silence, in breakdowns that become breakthroughs, in the terrifying clarity that sometimes comes when everything else falls apart. And it is in these moments that something deeper stirs, something real. For the addict, this moment is not optional. It is essential, because until something greater is encountered, something greater than the craving, greater than the pain, greater than the empty shell of the ego, nothing inside truly changes. The addiction might be paused, it might be interrupted, but it is not transformed. Jung believed that the only thing strong enough to truly counteract the grip of addiction was a spiritual experience. Not religion, not dogma, but a living, direct contact with the unconscious self. This experience often begins with descent into sorrow, into grief, into the raw truth of what we've been running from, and only in that descent does the ground of transformation emerge. We live in a world that avoids depth. We scroll, we consume, we medicate, we distract, but Jung's work reminds us that healing is never horizontal. It is vertical. It requires going down into the body, into the shadow, into the archetypal layers of the soul. The addict has already felt the call, though they may not realize it. The altered states they chase mimic the numinous. They imitate revelation, but they do not integrate it. They do not root the psyche in wholeness, they fragment it further. What the addict needs is not just sobriety. What they need is meaning, and meaning is not taught. It is encountered. It may come through a dream that won't leave you, through a symbol that burns itself into memory, through a moment of silence that cracks open the illusion of control. This is not about belief. It is about experience, the deep inner experience that shows you the truth of your own depths. The kind that cannot be unseen, the kind that shifts the axis of your life. Jung was clear. It is only this numinous encounter, this confrontation with the inner divine, that can reorient the soul. He saw it happen in his patients, not through willpower, not through advice, but through dream work, through facing the shadow, through moments of profound inner awakening. He saw people, haunted by addiction, slowly awaken to something more powerful than their compulsions, the inner self. And the self does not speak in slogans. It speaks in symbols, in paradox, in silence. It reveals itself when the ego finally stops trying to fix everything and starts listening. For some, this experience may feel like a breakdown. For others, like a visitation. For all, it marks the moment when the addiction loses its illusion of power, because something greater has entered consciousness. Jung believed that this was the only true antidote to addiction. A connection with the inner world so profound, so alive, that the need for false transcendence dissolves. Not because it's been forbidden, but because it's been replaced. Because once the soul has touched the real, it can no longer be satisfied with imitation. Carl Jung taught us that true healing does not come from suppression, but from confrontation, from understanding, from reintegration of what we've exiled within ourselves. We began with the idea that the addict is not just seeking escape, but wholeness. We explored the shadow self, where hidden truths cry out to be seen. We followed the path of individuation, the deep process of becoming who we truly are, layer by layer, wound by wound. And we arrived at the most essential truth, that to overcome addiction in its deepest form, we must make contact with the numinous, with that living mystery that speaks not to the ego, but to the soul. This is not a quick fix. It is not a linear path. It is a journey of descent and rebirth, of deep inner listening, and of rebuilding a life from the inside out. Jung did not offer a cure. He offered a path that begins not in resistance, but in awareness. Not in willpower, but in the courage to feel. To anyone walking this path now, you are not broken. You are becoming.